The courtroom buzzed with a tense, low murmur as people shuffled into their seats. The fluorescent lights cast a cold, sterile glow across the room, highlighting every anxious face. Among the crowd sat Camille Johnson, a well-known community activist whose reputation stretched far beyond the neighborhood. She was a force of nature, someone who tirelessly fought for justice, fairness, and equality. Her calm demeanor today, however, hid the fire that burned within. On the bench sat Judge Edward Sterling, an older man known for his strict adherence to the letter of the law. His reputation, however, was a mixed bag. To some, he was a beacon of justice, an unwavering figure who upheld the rules no matter the situation. To others, he represented something far less noble, an enforcer of a system that often failed those who needed fairness the most. Today, Sterling's gaze was stern and detached, his hands neatly folded over a docket of cases he would preside over. The case of Camille Johnson had piqued his interest, though not for the reasons most would expect. A small parking violation had escalated into something far more symbolic. Camille was here not just for herself, but for something bigger, a stand against what she perceived as a system of small injustices that added up to much more. The courtroom quieted as Camille's name was called. She rose gracefully, her posture confident but not arrogant. Every step she took toward the front of the room seemed to carry a weight far beyond that of a simple fine. This was about principle. As she stood before the bench, there was a palpable shift in the air. Everyone sensed it. Judge Sterling looked over his glasses at Camille, his expression unreadable. He had seen countless cases like this before, people coming in with grand ideas about justice and fairness. But there was something different about her. Still, he wasn't here to be swayed by emotions or movements. His job was to interpret the law. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice steady and controlled, "you're here regarding a parking violation, correct?" Camille nodded, her face calm, but her eyes intense. "That's correct, Your Honor. But I believe the circumstances around this violation deserve to be heard." Sterling raised an eyebrow. He'd heard it all before: excuses, justifications, stories meant to tug at his heartstrings. Still, something about her confidence made him curious, though he wouldn't show it. "Miss Johnson," he said, flipping through the paperwork in front of him, "this is a simple matter. You parked in a restricted area. The law is clear." "With respect, Your Honor," Camille replied, her voice firm but respectful, "it's not that simple. The area where I parked is a zone that's become increasingly restricted without public notice, impacting residents and workers. This isn't just about a parking ticket, it's about fairness." Sterling glanced back at her, a flicker of interest crossing his face before he masked it again. He leaned back slightly in his chair, considering her words. The room was silent, everyone hanging on to each exchange between the judge and the activist. It was clear that this wasn't going to be an ordinary hearing. "I see," he said after a long pause. "Fairness, you say. And yet, the law remains the law." Camille met his gaze without flinching. "I understand that, Your Honor. But laws are made by people, and sometimes they need to be challenged to reflect what's right." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, though not in anger. It was more of a measuring look, as though he was trying to get a read on her. He had seen many people use lofty ideals to mask personal gain, but something about Camille felt different, genuine. Still, he wasn't about to be drawn into a debate about legal philosophy. Not yet, at least. "Very well," he said, his tone neutral. "You'll have your chance to speak. But understand that this court deals in facts, not ideals." Camille nodded again, her expression unwavering. She knew what she was up against, but she also knew that moments like these mattered. The fight for justice wasn't always dramatic or loud. Sometimes it happened in quiet rooms like this one, where persistence and courage had to stand their ground. As Judge Sterling began to outline the procedures, there was a sense that this hearing would be anything but ordinary. Everyone in the room leaned in, sensing the quiet battle of wills that was unfolding. The stakes felt higher than a simple fine. This was about the soul of justice, and the players in this small drama seemed to know it. As the first witnesses were called, and the evidence was presented, Camille's heart beat steadily. She knew that this was just the beginning. What she didn't know was how this moment would ripple outward, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways no one could have predicted. And neither did Judge Sterling, who, despite himself, was beginning to feel the weight of something larger pressing in on his courtroom. This wasn't going to be an easy decision, and deep down he knew it. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with anticipation. Every rustle of paper and shuffle of feet echoed like a thunderclap. Camille Johnson stood at the center of it all, her posture steady and her eyes calm. But her mind was racing. She knew how these things went. The law didn't often bend for people like her. But if she could plant a seed, just one, maybe that would be enough. As the first witness, a city official responsible for parking regulations took the stand. Judge Sterling's gaze flickered between the man and Camille. The official, a thin, middle-aged man with glasses perched precariously on his nose, adjusted his tie nervously. He clearly wasn't used to being in this kind of spotlight. "State your name and position," the judge instructed. "I'm Mark Reynolds, Your Honor. I'm the Director of Parking Enforcement for the city," the man replied, his voice wavering slightly. Sterling nodded. "Mr. Reynolds, can you explain the reasoning behind the restrictions in the area where Miss Johnson received her citation?" Reynolds fidgeted, glancing at Camille before speaking. "Well, Your Honor, the restrictions were put in place due to increased traffic congestion. We've seen a rise in complaints from local businesses about blocked access, so we implemented no parking zones to alleviate the issue." Camille tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. When Sterling noticed, he raised a hand to indicate she could respond after the witness finished. "And how was this communicated to the public?" Sterling asked, his tone still even, but with an edge of curiosity. "We posted notices online and updated the signage," Reynolds answered quickly, as if rehearsed. Camille knew this was her moment. "Your Honor, may I ask Mr. Reynolds a question?" Sterling hesitated for a beat, then nodded. "Go ahead." Camille turned to face Reynolds directly, her voice steady. "Mr. Reynolds, are you aware that the online notices weren't accessible to many residents in that area due to lack of internet access?" Reynolds blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I wasn't aware of that specific issue." "And the signage," Camille continued, her voice gaining momentum. "Was it placed in locations where it could be easily seen by residents, particularly those who rely on street parking?" Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it again. His silence spoke volumes. Judge Sterling leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. There was something undeniably compelling about Camille's approach. She wasn't loud or confrontational, but she was methodical, peeling back layers of bureaucracy to reveal the cracks beneath. "I see," Sterling murmured, jotting something down on his notepad. He looked back up at Camille. "Do you have any further questions for Mr. Reynolds?" Camille shook her head. "Not at this time, Your Honor." Sterling dismissed the witness, who practically sprinted out of the courtroom, clearly relieved to be free of the scrutiny. The judge then turned his attention back to Camille. "Miss Johnson, I appreciate your passion, but this court is here to assess the validity of your specific citation. The broader issues you've raised, while important, may not be relevant to this case." Camille nodded, though a flicker of frustration crossed her face. "I understand, Your Honor, but context matters. It's not just about whether or not I broke the rule. It's about whether the rule itself is fair and just." Sterling leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. He wasn't used to defendants challenging the system in this way. Most people came in, paid their fine, and moved on. But Camille was different. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for an entire community that often went unheard. "Proceed," he said finally, gesturing for her to continue presenting her case. Camille took a deep breath, glancing briefly at the small group of supporters sitting behind her. Among them was Mrs. Thompson, a retired school teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years. Next to her was Jamal, a young father who worked 2 jobs and relied on street parking because his building had no designated spaces. Each of them had a story, a reason why this fight mattered. "Your Honor," Camille began, her voice clear and steady, "I'm not here to waste the court's time. But I believe this case represents something bigger. The area where I parked has been a lifeline for residents and workers in my community. The sudden enforcement of new restrictions, without adequate notice or consideration of the impact, has created hardship for many." Sterling raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. Camille pressed on. "I'm not saying people should ignore the law," she continued, "but laws should serve the people, not make their lives more difficult. When rules are implemented without input from those they affect, it creates a sense of injustice. And that's what I'm here to address." The judge remained silent, his expression unreadable. The courtroom, however, was anything but. Whispers filled the air as people exchanged glances, clearly moved by Camille's words. Even Sterling's clerk, a young woman who usually remained stoic during proceedings, seemed to be listening intently. After a long pause, Sterling finally spoke. "You've made your point, Miss Johnson. But the question remains, did you or did you not park in a restricted area?" Camille sighed softly. "I did, Your Honor. But I believe the circumstances warrant consideration." Sterling nodded slowly, tapping his pen against the desk. He was clearly weighing his options, caught between the rigid confines of the law and the undeniable truth of Camille's argument. The tension in the room was palpable, every eye fixed on the judge as they waited for his next move. "Miss Johnson," he said finally, "I'll need some time to review the evidence and consider your arguments. Court is adjourned until tomorrow." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the day's proceedings. Camille exhaled slowly, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. This wasn't over yet, but she had planted a seed. Whether it would grow remained to be seen. As the crowd began to disperse, Camille gathered her things, offering a small smile to her supporters. Mrs. Thompson patted her on the back, her eyes shining with pride. "You did good, Camille," the elderly woman said softly. "Real good." Camille nodded, though her mind was already racing ahead to what tomorrow might bring. This wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. It was about justice, and that fight was far from over. The sun was setting as Camille walked out of the courthouse, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the grey weight of the courtroom. She felt drained but resolute. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a moment that could ripple through the lives of countless people who had been silenced by bureaucracy and overlooked by those in power. Jomal caught up with her in the parking lot, his face lined with worry, but also a flicker of hope. "Camille, you think the judge is really listening?" I mean, it felt like he was, but you never know. Camille sighed, leaning against her car. "I didn't know Jamal. Sterling's tough. He's not the kind of man who bends easily. But I think we got him thinking, and that's a start." Jamal nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know, it's not just about parking for me. It's about feeling like we matter, like someone's actually paying attention." "I know," Camille said softly. "That's why we can't stop now." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as other people filtered out of the courthouse, their conversations hushed but charged with emotion. Mrs. Thompson waved as she headed toward her car, a warm but tired smile on her face. Camille felt a surge of gratitude. This wasn't just her fight. It was theirs. And that gave her strength. As she drove home, Camille's thoughts wandered to her childhood. Growing up in this neighborhood, she had seen firsthand how small, seemingly insignificant rules could chip away at people's dignity. Her father, a janitor who worked double shifts to keep food on the table, often talked about the little things that wore people down. A ticket here, a fine there. It all added up until one day you realized you were drowning in it. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from Maria, a fellow activist and close friend. "Asterisk, you were amazing today. We're all proud of you. Let me know if you need anything, Asterisk." Camille smiled, typing back a quick thank you before pulling into her driveway. The house was modest but cozy, filled with memories and the quiet hum of resilience. She stepped inside, kicked off her shoes, and collapsed onto the couch, letting out a long breath. The battle was far from over, but for tonight she allowed herself a moment of rest. The next morning, Camille was up early, fueled by coffee and determination. She spent hours reviewing her notes, poring over case law and precedents that might help bolster her argument. The more she read, the clearer it became that the system was stacked against people like her. But that only made her more determined. By midday, she received a call from Maria. "Hey, I've got some news," Maria said, her voice crackling slightly through the phone. "I talked to a reporter from the local paper. They're interested in covering your case." Camille's heart skipped a beat. Media attention could be a double-edged sword, but it also had the power to shine a light on issues that often stayed hidden in the shadows. "You think it's a good idea?" "I do," Maria replied firmly. "People need to hear this story. It's not just about a parking ticket. It's about fairness, dignity, and the right to be heard." Camille nodded, even though Maria couldn't see her. "All right, let's do it." Later that afternoon, Camille met with the reporter, a young woman named Rachel who had a reputation for digging deep into local issues. They sat in a small cafe, the hum of conversations around them creating a comforting backdrop. "Tell me everything," Rachel said, her notepad ready. "Start from the beginning." Camille took a deep breath and began recounting the events that had led her to the courtroom. She spoke about the sudden enforcement of parking restrictions, the lack of communication with the community, and the broader impact on people's lives. Rachel listened intently, her pen moving swiftly across the page. As they talked, Camille noticed a man at a nearby table watching them. He was dressed in a suit, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away. Camille's instincts kicked in. A lifetime of activism had taught her to be cautious. She made a mental note to stay vigilant. By the time they finished, Rachel was brimming with questions and ideas. "This is powerful," she said, her eyes shining. "I'm going to write something that really captures what's happening here." Camille thanked her, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. But as she walked back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder but saw nothing unusual. Still the unease lingered. That night, as she prepared for the next day in court, Camille's mind was restless. She thought about Judge Sterling and the weight of his decision. Would he see the humanity behind the legal arguments? Would he recognize the impact of his ruling on a community already stretched thin? The next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded. Word had spread about Camille's case, and people had come to show their support. Camille felt a swell of emotion as she took her seat, aware of every eye on her. Judge Sterling entered, his expression as inscrutable as ever. He glanced around the room, clearly noting the increased turnout. When his gaze landed on Camille, there was a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, or curiosity. It was hard to tell. As the proceedings began, Camille felt the tension ratchet up. The city's attorney presented their case, sticking strictly to the letter of the law. Camille listened carefully, noting every point she would need to counter. When it was her turn to speak, she stood with confidence, her voice steady. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of upholding the law. But laws are meant to serve the people, not the other way around. This case is about more than a parking ticket. It's about fairness, equity, and the responsibility of those in power to listen to the communities they serve." The room was silent, every person hanging on her words. Even Judge Sterling seemed to lean in slightly, his eyes locked on hers. Camille continued, weaving in stories of the people affected by the new restrictions, painting a picture of a community struggling to stay afloat. She spoke of hope, resilience, and the need for justice that went beyond mere technicalities. As she finished, there was a beat of silence, followed by a murmur of approval from the crowd. Judge Sterling sat back, his expression thoughtful. The room held its collective breath, waiting for his next words. But Sterling, ever the careful arbiter, simply nodded and announced a recess. Camille exhaled, her heart pounding. The fight was far from over, but she had done all she could. Now it was in the judge's hands, and the weight of that uncertainty hung in the air, thick and heavy, as everyone filed out of the courtroom, waiting to see what would come next. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Even the creak of the old wooden benches seemed quieter as people shifted in their seats, waiting. Camille stood near the defense table, her hands resting on the edge, fingers lightly tapping. It was a small motion, but one that hinted at the storm of thoughts running through her mind. She had presented everything, laid bare the struggles of her community, and now all she could do was wait. Judge Sterling hadn't said much when he called for the recess, but there had been something in his eyes, a flicker of conflict, maybe even doubt. It was hard to tell. Camille watched him closely whenever she could, looking for signs that he was wrestling with more than just the facts of the case. There was something human there, beneath the robe and the stern demeanor, and that gave her hope. As she paced outside the courthouse during the break, Maria joined her, handing her a bottle of water. "You doing okay?" Maria asked, her voice soft but steady. Camille took a long sip before answering. "I don't know. It feels like we're on the edge of something, but I can't tell which way it's going to tip." Maria nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I think you've done more than enough. Sterling's a tough one, but he's also known for being fair. Maybe that's all we need." A small crowd had gathered outside, a mix of reporters, supporters, and curious onlookers. Camille could hear snippets of conversations, people debating the merits of the case, questioning what it would mean if she won or lost. The tension was palpable, a live wire running through the air, sparking with every passing second. When they re-entered the courtroom, the atmosphere felt even heavier. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second dragging out like an eternity. Camille glanced at Journal, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. Mrs. Thompson sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her lips moving silently, as though in prayer. Sterling returned, his robe flowing as he took his seat. His face was unreadable, a mask of professionalism that gave nothing away. Camille felt her pulse quicken, each beat echoing in her ears. This was it. Whatever was going to happen, it would happen now. "Miss Johnson," Sterling began, his voice even, "I've reviewed your arguments and the evidence presented." Camille straightened, every muscle in her body tense. The entire room seemed to lean forward, hanging on his every word. Sterling continued, his gaze sweeping over the room before landing on her. "This case, as you've pointed out, is about more than a simple parking violation. It touches on broader issues of fairness, community impact, and the balance between enforcing laws and serving the public good." Camille's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. She felt a bead of sweat trail down her back, but she kept her face composed, her eyes locked on the judge. "There are times," Sterling said slowly, "when the law must be examined in light of the circumstances it seeks to regulate. Justice is not always black and white." The room buzzed with whispered conversations, but Sterling silenced them with a sharp look. Camille's breath hitched. This was the moment. Everything she had fought for, everything her community had endured, it all came down to this. Sterling's gaze softened, just for a moment, and Camille saw something in his eyes. Understanding. Compassion, but also the weight of responsibility. He leaned forward, his next words poised to tip the balance. The tension was unbearable, a knot tightening in everyone's chest as they waited for the final verdict. And then Sterling took a deep breath, and the room went utterly silent. Sterling's pause stretched on, each second magnifying the weight of his next words. The courtroom remained in a fragile, suspended state, every breath held as if one sound could shatter the tension. Just when it seemed he would deliver the final ruling, Sterling surprised everyone. "Before I make my decision," he said, his voice measured but firm, "I want to address a matter that's come to my attention." Miss Johnson stepped forward. Camille blinked, caught off guard. She exchanged a quick glance with Maria, whose expression mirrored her own confusion. Gathering herself, Camille moved to stand directly in front of the bench, her heart racing. Sterling leaned forward, folding his hands. "It appears there's a concern about how this case was flagged for court in the first place. I've received documents indicating that your citation may have been selectively enforced. He held up a file, thick with papers. This raises serious questions about the integrity of the process. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Camille's mind spun. Selectively enforced. Implications were staggering. Was this more than a simple parking dispute? Suddenly, the stakes felt much higher. If the citation had been part of a targeted effort, the injustice ran far deeper than she realized. Your Honor, a city's attorney interjected, scrambling to recover. I assure you, the ticket was issued in accordance with standard procedures. Sterling's gaze hardened. Standard procedures that seemed to disproportionately affect one part of the city. Care to explain that? The attorney faltered, flipping through his notes, clearly unprepared for this turn. Camille felt a surge of adrenaline. This was her chance to expose what she'd suspected all along, that the system wasn't just flawed, it was weaponized. Your Honor, Camille said, her voice steady but firm, this isn't just about my ticket. It's about a pattern. People in my neighborhood have been targeted by policies that make their daily lives harder. Selective enforcement is just another way to keep us in line. Sterling nodded slowly. That's a serious accusation, Miss Johnson. I can prove it, Camille replied. I've been collecting stories from people in the community, documenting how these rules are applied differently depending on where you live and who you are. The judge gestured for her to continue. Camille took a deep breath and turned to the crowd. Jamal, she called, motioning for him to step forward. Jamal hesitated, glancing nervously around, but the quiet nod from Mrs. Thompson gave him the courage he needed. He approached the bench, his hands clenched at his sides. Tell the court what happened to you, Camille urged gently. Jamal cleared his throat. I got a ticket, same as Camille, but I didn't even see the new signs go up. One day, I was parked outside my building after a long shift, and the next morning, there was a ticket on my windshield. No warning, no chance to adjust. And did you challenge the citation? Sterling asked. Jamal shook his head. I couldn't afford to miss work for a court date. Paying the fine hurt, but losing a day's wages would have been worse. Camille nodded, stepping in. That's the choice so many of us face. Pay the fine or risk losing more. It's a cycle designed to keep us struggling. Sterling leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. This goes beyond the scope of today's hearing, he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't dismissing the issue. But it's not something I can ignore. A city attorney, visibly sweating now, tried to regain control. Your Honor, if we're discussing systemic issues, that's a matter for policymakers, not this court. Sterling raised a hand to silence him. Justice is the court's concern, Counselor, and what I'm hearing suggests a potential miscarriage of justice. The room buzzed again, the energy shifting from tension to something more electric, hope maybe, or determination. Camille felt it too, a sense that the walls were beginning to crack, light seeping through the fractures. Sterling sighed, rubbing his temple. Miss Johnson, I'll need time to consider this new information. But know this, your courage in bringing these issues forward has not gone unnoticed. Camille nodded, her chest tight with emotion. She returned to her seat, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was bigger than she'd imagined. The fight wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had been silenced, marginalized, or pushed aside. As the judge adjourned the session, Camille felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown, their faces a patchwork of curiosity and support. Reporters pushed microphones toward her, shouting questions. What's next, Camille? One called out. Camille met their gaze, standing taller than she felt. We keep fighting, she said simply, until things change. Maria appeared at her side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. You've got this, she whispered. Camille nodded, but as they walked to her car, a familiar figure caught her eye, the man from the cafe. He stood at the edge of the crowd, watching her with the same inscrutable expression. Camille's heart quickened. Something about him didn't sit right. Maria, she murmured, Do you see that guy over there? The one in the suit. Maria glanced over, frowning. Yeah? Why? I think he's been following me. Maria's eyes narrowed. Let's not take any chances. Come on. They slipped through the crowd, keeping a low profile as they made their way to the car. Camille's mind raced. The fight for justice had just become more complicated, and far more dangerous. The next morning, Camille barely slept. Every sound outside her window made her sit up, heart pounding. The strange man from the courthouse haunted her thoughts. Maria had insisted on staying over, and now, as the first light filtered through the curtains, they both sat at the kitchen table in silence, sipping coffee. I checked around last night, Maria said quietly. No sign of him, but we should be careful. Camille nodded, her mind already spinning with strategies. She knew the stakes had risen. This wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. Someone didn't want her digging deeper. But fear had never stopped her before, and it wouldn't now. By mid-morning, she received an unexpected call from Judge Sterling's office. The hearing would reconvene earlier than planned. Camille's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure if that was good or bad, but there was no turning back now. When they arrived at the courthouse, the atmosphere was charged. The room was packed again, but this time there was a palpable tension. Camille scanned the faces, looking for the man in the suit, but he was nowhere to be seen. Still, the unease lingered. Judge Sterling took his seat, his expression serious. After reviewing the additional information and considering the arguments presented, I've reached a decision. Camille held her breath. Every muscle in her body felt tight, coiled like a spring. Jamal gave her a reassuring nod from across the room, but even he looked nervous. This case highlights a critical issue, Sterling continued. The law must be applied fairly, without bias or selective enforcement. In this instance, it's clear that the ticket issued to Miss Johnson was part of a broader pattern that disproportionately affected certain communities. The murmur in the courtroom grew louder, but Sterling's next words cut through the noise. Therefore, I am dismissing the citation against Miss Johnson. Relief washed over Camille, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of something more profound. Vindication. The room erupted in applause, but Sterling raised his hands, silencing them. However, he said, his gaze hardening, this case has revealed a deeper issue that must be addressed. I am recommending an independent investigation into the city's enforcement practices. Justice cannot exist without accountability. Camille's eyes welled up. This was more than she had hoped for. The fight wasn't over, but they had won a crucial battle. She turned to Maria, who grinned and squeezed her arm. Jamal pumped his fist in the air, and Mrs. Thompson wiped away tears. As they left the courthouse, Camille felt lighter, the burden of uncertainty finally lifting. Reporters swarmed her, but she answered their questions with a calm confidence, knowing the story would now reach a wider audience. This wasn't just her victory. It belonged to everyone who had stood beside her. But just as they reached the steps, Camille spotted him again, the man in the suit lurking at the edge of the crowd. Her heart skipped a beat. This time, though, she didn't look away. Instead, she walked straight toward him, her chin held high. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. The man hesitated, then smiled, a disarming, almost apologetic smile. "Miss Johnson, I'm not here to intimidate you. Quite the opposite." Camilla frowned. "Then why have you been following me?" He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "My name's Eric Reynolds. I'm an attorney, specializing in civil rights cases. I've been following your story, and I think we might be able to take this fight even further." Camille stared at the card, her mind racing. It was the last thing she had expected. Maria stepped up beside her, eyeing Eric warily. "What's your angle?" Maria asked bluntly. Eric chuckled. "No angle. Just someone who believes in what you're doing. You've started something important, and I want to help." Camille studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of deceit. But all she saw was sincerity, and maybe, just maybe, the next step in her journey. I'll think about it, she said finally, slipping the card into her pocket. Eric nodded. Take your time. But don't wait too long. Momentum is everything. As he walked away, Camille felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The immediate battle was over, but a new path was unfolding before her. One that could lead to real, lasting change. She turned to Maria, a determined smile playing on her lips. We're just getting started, she said softly. Maria grinned. Damn right we are. Together, they walked down the courthouse steps, ready to face whatever came next. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Camille felt like they were winning.